Rana Bishara's artwork is deeply embedded in and informed by the Palestinian experience of displacement and exile, and the desire of Palestinian refugees to return to the lands that they were displaced from. We sat in the courtyard of her studio, an old stone house that her grandmother was born in, and spoke about her work, her identity, her hopes, her fears, and her rage at the blatant and repeated abuses that have been inflicted upon Palestine and the Palestinians by Israel and its powerful colonial backers. Rana's work functions simultaneously as an elegy to the Palestinian Nakba, an unmasking of the brutality of the Israeli occupation of Palestine, and a critique of the biased Western media's depiction of the Palestinians' struggle against their occupiers. Her conceptual approach is diverse. Some of her projects employ relatively confrontational and overt depictions of the brutality and humiliations inflicted upon the Palestinians by the occupying forces. Other projects develop subtle and often enigmatic metaphors that visually and emotionally seduce the viewers to contemplate the strength, tenderness, resilience, and passions of the Palestinians. Her choice of materials range from conventional sculptural elements such as wood, glass, and steel, to common utilitarian elements such as chocolate, cactus, bread, and balloons. The objects employed in her work perform as surrogates for the body and spirit of Palestine and its people. Her work, in both its physical and conceptual manifestations, is an expression of the inseparable blending of the personal and political experiences that define the identity of every Palestinian.
Really so happy when I'm in nature because it's like silent and it's peaceful and it's like my home,
Absolutely.
And this is wild childhood. We used to come here and make, we didn't have any.
And this is
this is what we used to play
This
with.
is what you come back to as a sculptor, as a visual artist.
This is nature.
This is where all of your early training.
You see, we do this like this. We used to throw.
I have known Rana Bishara professionally for a few years and had never seen her so relaxed and happy as when I accompanied her for a walk in the Wadi, a narrow valley nestled in the hilly outskirts of Tarshiha, a Palestinian village in the northern Galilee. The relaxed walk with Rana in the sheltered reserve of the Wadi provided a journey in the land of Palestine that could, in the hiker's imagination, offer a glimpse of Palestine before the 1948 occupation. Or if the hiker's imagination was really fertile, the 21st century Palestine, free from occupation. But the reality of life when walking with a Palestinian in any part of historical Palestine, even within the sheltered serenity of the Wadi, is that you can never leave behind, never get away from the 60-year history of displacement, occupation, and bitter ethnic tension that continues to define the relationship between Palestinians and Israelis. Each of the two cultures wants to hold on to every inch of land claimed by the other. The Palestinians strongly feel that they belong to the land, while the Israelis insist that the land belongs to them. Feelings of belonging and claims of ownership irrevocably separate yet intimately connect Arabs and Jews in their struggle for a land that is called Palestine by one group and Israel by the other. The deeply seated feelings of belonging to the land is very strong and central to the psyche of Palestinians. That feeling of connection to a land that they have inhabited for centuries has been further amplified by a 60-year history of catastrophic displacement and brutal denial from the very land that they hold sacred. The establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 forced the Palestinians to walk a trail of tears for the past 60 years. A trail charted by imperial politics and colonial oppression. A trail built on a violent history of denial and lies. A trail of tears marked at every turn by inescapable feelings of belonging, memories of the places they belong to, and the restless desire to return to the land where they belong. My walk with Rana in the Wadi further revealed a personal connection to the land that is nothing less than politically, spiritually, and emotionally profound. This connection to the land and culture of Palestine shapes every aspect of Rana's identity and informs every one of her artworks.
And they used to throw up big balls of metal on the house to
tear the whole thing apart, right?
And so a lot of people, like most of the village has, trying to escape or find a safe place.
Mm-hmm.
So they end up like losing their properties and stuff like that. A lot of families has taken their stuff and moved up to another villages, to Yanuh or to other locations. So, and at some point they took the young people and they loaded them on trucks and they actually forced them to leave. They throw them, they call it, when you ask my father, I said we were thrown away from the country. It's not kabuna, it's like...
like spilled us.
Yeah. So they took mostly the young people and throw them away out of the border to Lebanon. So they came to Lebanon, to Syria, and then they came back to Lebanon, and then they came back. But it was a long way of 2 years of journey, and mostly who were permitted, who were let in, mostly Christians. And this is very strange, kind of my theory about the situation, that the Christians weren't the owners of the land much. So the Muslims were the owners of the land, so they kind of tried to avoid them coming back to keep the land and their property. So,
wow.
So this is kind of a brief...
Does your father talk about this history very much, or is he one of the...
It is very painful.
Yeah.
Very painful for that. I know. And this is what I think he passed to me, that like even when we talk now about politics and stuff, he doesn't know how to express that properly, and it's like the pain mixed with the guilt and with the whole idea of like being occupied. It's a trauma. It's a life trauma, and I don't blame him, but at the same time I get angry sometimes. We get into really big arguments for nothing. So it makes me feel that they ruined generations of our people, and that's very unfortunate.
The village of Tarshiha was ethnically cleansed of its Palestinian inhabitants by the military forces of the newly established State of Israel on December 1st, 1948. The village was heavily bombed from the air, with many of its structures destroyed and the great majority of its 5,000 inhabitants forcibly expelled and sent into exile. Tarshiha was one of the last villages to experience the ethnic cleansing that destroyed Palestinian civil and political cultures between December 1947 and December 1948. Palestinians refer to this period as the Nakba, or the Great Disaster, while the Israelis celebrate it as their War of Independence. During the ethnic cleansing campaign, 85% of the Palestinian population that lived in the land that became Israel were driven from their homes and sent into permanent exile. The remaining 15% of that population were internally displaced refugees. Although they suffered greatly and still bear the psychological scars of expulsion, the people of Tarshiha were luckier than most of the other 800,000 Palestinians that were ethnically cleansed as a result of Israel's effort to establish an exclusively Jewish state. After a 2-year period in exile, approximately 25% of the population of Tarshiha were permitted to return to their village and to rebuild their homes. They now live as non-Jewish citizens in the Jewish state. 95% of Tarshiha's fertile lands were confiscated shortly after the establishment of Israel and were given to European Jewish settlers for their exclusive use. Through her work, Rana wants to convey the wounds of the heart inflicted upon her father's generation and all subsequent generations of Palestinians. She wants to bear witness to a once multicultural Palestinian society that has been destroyed and a once thriving agricultural society that has been irrevocably changed. In the creative work of Rana Bishara, the cactus is used to depict the trauma imposed on Palestine and to express the tremendous resilience of its people.
Yeah, I mean, like for me, it's very obvious. For me, cactus is immediately a symbol of Palestine. But for people who are coming from a different society, who will say, I mean, why she have chosen the cactus? I think it's a tough plant that could show or like that could reflect our life. Because wherever you throw a cactus, a piece, even a small piece, it will grow up. And this shows the toughness and how it's so stubborn that could grow up everywhere. And that has nice fruit, that has sweet fruit at the end, regardless of the thorns, but you still have the fruit. I never use the fruit in my work, but interesting enough, subconsciously I kind of start using the cactus with the thorns, the prickly pear. I actually, in one of my early works, I did a piece called Sweetie, where I dipped a piece of prickly pear in half dipped in chocolate, melted chocolate. So and then I hang it and it starts dripping. So that could summarize maybe a lot of things that I might want to say in this interview about the contradiction of life here. I live in a beautiful landscape in the Galilee, the fresh air and the whole blue sky, and it's very everybody will love to live here, but at the same time, people here, they cannot enjoy it. They have no chance to enjoy it. And that's why, I mean, I combined the chocolate with the cactus.
The chocolate's aroma, clearly perceived when viewing the work in person, reminds us that the potential sweetness of life still exists and lies somewhere beneath the dark and bitter veil of occupation. The prickly cactus thorns penetrating the hardened chocolate serves as a double metaphor. The thorns reinforce for the viewer the sharp pain experienced by Palestinians under occupation, as well as the pointed spears of resistance that define the right and duty of the occupied to resist their oppressors. Here again, the cactus slices also remind the viewer of the resilience, toughness, and endurance of the Palestinians. This piece is indicative of Bishara's subtle and layered references that require the viewer to become an active participant in decoding complex and often competing cultural and political signifiers.
So another piece that I worked with cactus, that I took the cactus, the same prickly pear cactus, and I actually sliced it into small pieces and I put it in a pressure jar. That also expresses the situation here more accurately as for the political situation where we are living under so much pressure, so much limitations in our life. we have nowhere to go. So it's about time to kind of, when is that issue gonna be resolved?
In a simple yet powerful work by Bishara called Homage to Palestine, created in 1998, the artist tightly packed fresh cuttings of cactus in a sealed, clear pickling jar to express the constant pressure and restrictions imposed on the Palestinians. The jar of cactus cuttings referenced the violent dismemberment and displacement of Palestinians from their land. It also references the oppressive restriction of movement created by tightly sealed and heavily guarded borders imposed on the Palestinian territories, as well as the limited growth opportunities available in a densely packed and carefully preserved container of occupation. This eloquently simple piece presents Palestine and Palestinian nationalism as an entity that has been securely contained and controlled. It represents the current reality of Palestine as a presence that can be easily moved to the back shelf of the international discourse on liberation, justice, and human rights. Hidden from view on the back shelf, Palestinian aspirations would inevitably fall in the category of out of sight, out of mind, and continue to be forgotten and neglected until they expired. The most menacing aspect of this work is that it addresses the ongoing desire by right-wing Israelis to transfer the remaining Palestinian population from Israel and the Palestinian territories. Uprooted, dismembered, and restricted, the sealed container of Palestinians can be easily shipped off to a distant land. Bishara's simple jar of cactus eloquently deconstructs Israel's historical strategy to create an exclusively Jewish state in Palestine, a Jewish state on Arab lands that is free of Arabs. Yet Bishara's jar of occupation contains a persistent degree of hope. The contents of the jar, cactus slices, are remarkably adaptive and patient. When the jar is broken and its contents released, many of the resilient cactus slices will manage to set roots and gradually begin to thrive in their native soil.
Also, cactus, just to mention that in Arabic means to be patient. Sabr, Sabr Ayub, and all this kind of connotations to the cactus. So I actually wanted to preserve the patience that's left with us, that maybe is going to be preserved for the future. Of course, it's a metaphorical and ironic at the same time.
The cactus plant, called sabr in Arabic, has become one of the most enduring and widely recognized symbols of the Palestinian Nakba and Palestinian resistance. The native, broad-leaved cactus, with its prickly skin, moist interior, and sweet, seed-laden fruit, can be seen growing wild throughout Palestine and Israel. Very often, dense clusters of cacti are the only markers indicating the ruins of the 531 Palestinian villages that were depopulated, completely destroyed, and erased from all maps in or shortly after 1948 by the newly founded Israeli state. In those destroyed villages, the cactus grows freely and widely in and around the ruins of old stone homes and once public buildings. The cactus of Palestine stands as a stubborn living reminder of the deceased and dispossessed, but it is also seen as a powerful symbol of resilience and hope. The cactus is a plant that refuses to die, refuses to disappear. It survives, even thrives with little or no moisture, requires no tending, and even when cut or uprooted will eventually grow back in the same area. Cuttings from one cactus, when transported to a different garden, adapt to the new soil, set broad roots, and gradually begin to thrive. It's no wonder that the cactus has become one of the most dominant and most revered symbols of modern Palestine. Ironically, Israeli Jews have also adapted the word for cactus, or sabra in Hebrew, as a national symbol. In this case, the cactus refers to Jewish Israeli females as being tough, sharp and dangerous on the outside, but moist, sweet, and fertile on the inside. I asked Rana how she felt about Israel's appropriation of this quintessential Palestinian symbol.
I mean, I don't know. It's kind of funny.
You want to even talk about that?
For me, it's okay to talk about it, to explain my view about it, because it's kind of, and this is a proof that this place was full of Palestinians, agriculturing and eating and living out of this place, and not as a desert, you know, as they pretend to be. So it's kind of the generation who was born here when they came after they established their country. They say that we are Sabar, that we were born here, and the image, like the image of the cactus, was already here. So the cactus was before they came, so they adopted it as part of their culture, and I think this is kind of very contradictory. You know, I mean, they should admit that they are Palestinians first, and there are Jewish Palestinians living here. So it's kind of, I see it as very ironic that, I mean, I don't want to even. It's not my right to take that from them. At the same time, I feel like more you know, they give legitimacy to the place that they adopted the symbol from it. So I see it this way. I'm not sure if they will like it or not, but these are the facts, you know.
Bishara created a recent image employing the motif of the cactus during the July-August 2006 invasion of Lebanon by Israel. The image replicates the Lebanese flag, but replaces the iconic cedar on the flag with a cactus leaf that has been carefully cut to assume the shape of the cedar tree. Bishara's blending of Palestinian and Lebanese national icons is a powerful gesture of solidarity that pays homage to the brutalized Lebanese population and unifies the two people in the repeated horrors inflicted upon them by the actions of the Israeli military. The image is also a defiant declaration to all occupiers and oppressors that the Lebanese and Palestinians are more united than ever in their desire and will to resist, persevere, and eventually thrive in their respective homelands.
Talking about art and politics, you cannot ignore the political facts and political laws that were imposed on you while living in Israel. So one of the most interesting and very satiric, very ironic thing is about the roadmap, where George W. Bush has imposed it on the peace process of the Middle East and between the Palestinians, and to resolve the issue of Palestine. And I wasn't surprised of how ignorant was the solution, or how ignorant was the steps were taken to resolve the issue. So I wanted to address that in my artwork.
Bishara has made numerous works with cactus, both fresh and dried, uprooted and rerouted. In her installation, Who Buys the Roadmap to Peace, she has sewn dozens of old cactus leaves together, forming ghostly screens of the uprooted, decomposing, lace-like cactus leaves. Her suspended cactus screens create a haunting yet beautiful presence that evokes the ghost of the dispossessed, still hovering and haunting their ruined and occupied villages. Instead of a roadmap to peace, Bishara's installation suggests a roadmap to nowhere. Her work is a poignant reflection on the deadly course charted for the Palestinians by the Western powers. This roadmap, as it is eloquently analyzed in Bishara's ghostly veil of desiccated cacti, leads only to the further and permanent displacement of Palestinians from their lands and to the unending denial of the right of return for the 5 million exiled Palestinians. When permanently detached from the land, even the Sabr, the most patient and resilient hope for Palestinian nationalism, could eventually dry up and die.
I think my choice of using installation as a medium is very important and I feel it's kind of part of my life because art is my life and life is my art. So it's kind of more or less metaphorical to like experimenting through my childhood up until now these days. It's kind of creates kind of not an illusion, it creates an atmosphere around you that you want to express it through your art, through your materials around, because I'm very I sense everything around me. I'm very sensitive toward materials, toward scenes, so I think installation can bring it all together. To be included in the situation is important in my work. To be let's say if it is accurate, but to be hugged into the space, it's or to be surrounded by the work is being part of the work, because I want my viewer or my audience to experiment in a way I'm not sure if this message will go through when they are coming to the space, but at least they will sense something. So this all these things that makes the artist more aware of his environment and wanted to actually get it to his audience. And in terms of mediums, I have no limit of medium. I love whenever I feel like there is an accurate material that can express my message or get the message out, or could be very good target to bring things out. I like to express it and bring it to the public or to the audience. But I feel the urgent need to use the bread these days because of the situation. We are under economical siege, starvation policy that's happening in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and that brings a lot of memories from the childhood, where I remember my grandmother saying about the starvation and all this. So it's I wanted to point to the situation where children has really to work hard to find their bread, although it has to be very basic material. So I took the bread and I created a piggy box. I'm not sure if that's the correct term.
Piggy bank.
A piggy bank or a coin box, where I took the bread, I opened it from both sides, and I actually created this small crack in it where you can put the coins, and then I stitch it back with black thread. And it's the form is showing there is a metaphor of collecting money for Palestinians. At the same time, the bread is so fragile it could dissolve very easily, and that talks about the whole economical sanctions that we are going through, and about where the people are donating money but the Palestinians are not getting the money. And so it's talking about the whole issue of starving the Palestinians to death, and that's the last thing we could accept, So I'm gonna be doing a performance with this piece where I can really again want the audience or the viewers to be part of it, and the fact that I'm gonna be sewing the bread live in front of them, that could maybe bring more attention to the audience or to the people or to the human beings, because so far we haven't really seen a lot of reactions from what is happening lately in Palestine, especially with the tragedy of Gaza. We haven't seen really people who are really condemning these massacres. So I think maybe through my art I can express it and make a change. Another piece of bread that I did is I actually pushed some pins into a loaf of bread, and I wanted to create kind of an illusion of bread, but it's impossible to eat it. It's an unfunctional bread. At the same time, with the other one, the collecting the money with a loaf of bread, this is kind of the last desperate call for saving the Palestinian people.
Another medium that Bishara has used in a number of projects are thin sheets of glass. Viewing the works she produced with glass physically and psychologically involves the viewer in the image and ideas she depicts. This fragile, transparent, and potentially dangerous medium is extremely difficult to handle when presented as a book, and, as you will soon see, even more difficult to traverse when arranged as a spatial installation. The images drawn and printed on the glass are translucent and consequently difficult to clearly see and understand. Bishara's strategy of employing translucent images on fragile and potentially dangerous surfaces forces the viewer to become hyper-aware of his or her position in relation to the images and ideas she depicts. This physical awareness extends in the mind of the perceptive viewer to a consideration of one's emotional, intellectual, and political affiliations with the experiences she presents. Bishara's homage to 531 destroyed Palestinian villages and towns commemorates the Palestinian villages eradicated by Israel in 1948. The fragile yet physically heavy object is made of thin sheets of glass that have been bound together into a book. The 10 glass pages are covered with translucent, handwritten text listing the names of all of the destroyed villages. To view the book, one must very carefully turn the glass pages. This action is performed with the conscious risk of shattering the fragile book and injuring oneself. Bishara's book eloquently speaks of the disappearance of those villages and the delicate and potentially dangerous responsibility we have in preserving their ghostly memories.
The work is more related to my personal experience also as being away from my country for 4 years, achieving my studies in the US. So I started collecting images of war. So one day I was searching on the net, mostly human rights websites and Arab websites that kind of really show the situation here in Palestine, makes it more, give you a more accurate picture on the situation. So I decided to kind of dig and find more pictures about abuse and killing and children and women and, bombing and all these things. So I came across one picture that struck me the most is 2 Israeli soldiers are posing next to a body of a Palestinian who they shot and killed next to a store. A third soldier is taking the picture. So that has really outraged me and I couldn't really express it. So over the time I tried to kind of maybe digest this image and so I thought about the sadistic behaviors of human beings. So and at the same time it was very, very kind of outrageous for me to see other pictures of naked Palestinians and blindfolded, kneeled on the floor, humiliated. Everyday life is miserable. Checkpoints and more over and over and over, and constant everyday life. It became like a routine. So I thought about the chocolate and the addiction to chocolate and the addiction of seeing these pictures. So I made these links between the three things that came through my mind, and I wanted to kind of express how outrageous I am from kind of somebody is so enjoying that they are letting people suffer. At the same time, the other side is suffering much. So I took this material, start experimenting a lot with it. One time I took it with a piece of a print of Goya, a Spanish artist, and I kind of enlarged it, blowed it up to like 2 meters by 2 meters, and I did a red cross in the middle as like a shooting center. And then I put a shelf of chocolate, and then I put these pictures that I was talking about, the abuse and the killing. So the other part of my experiment with chocolate is all talking about the human acts, the human behaviors. And I took my body as part of the project also, because if you don't feel it on your body, you don't understand it. So because I am Palestinian, and I think I am more or less involved in that, but I'm kind of far away. So I want to put myself back in the picture and experiment it. But like this seductive material, it was boiled chocolate, melted chocolate. So I created kind of a block of chocolate, and I kneeled with my knees with the hot chocolate to create this impression of these people who were kneeled on their knees and their eyes are blindfolded. So, and I actually at the same time kind of was kind of a performance, but it's a personal performance. I didn't want to perform it in front of an audience because it's kind of more meditative for me and more kind of getting to the process of understanding my psychology at the same time after seeing all these images. And in general, art is kind of meditative and like your own way of meditation. So it kind of became more personal and political in a way. And then I came back and I used the chocolate again, casting a camera with chocolate. That also became a dialogue between these images and the one who is taking these images, like who is really standing behind the camera and daring to take these pictures and documenting these horrors. And the connection with Goya and all these historical questions, whether the history is repeating itself or not, what's going on. So these things has raised a lot of questions in my life, in my artistic career, in my...
One of Bishar's most ambitious works is an installation entitled Blindfolded History, 1948 to 2003. The work was first exhibited in 2003 and consisted of 56 sheets of thin glass. The number of sheets of glass referenced the 56 years of occupation that had passed since the beginning of the Palestinian Nakba. The majority of the sheets of glass are suspended from the ceiling with thin, almost invisible nylon wire. A few of the sheets of glass are arranged vertically on shelves that are hung along the wall of the deliberately cramped installation space. When approaching the installation, the viewer is struck by the seductive shimmering light glittering off the glass sheets that are tightly arranged in close proximity to each other. The immediate feeling conveyed is that the space is simultaneously dense and vast. Before entering the installation, the viewer notices a translucent reddish-brown rectangle imposed at about eye level on each sheet of glass. They appear to be photographic images, but they are difficult to discern from a distance. The viewer is compelled to approach and enter the shimmering maze-like installation in order to clearly see the individual photographic prints. Upon entering the installation, the feeling of glittering opulence experienced from the perimeters is immediately replaced by a powerful sense of dread and tragedy. The events rendered in the prints depict the brutal humiliations, terror, and suffering that are experienced daily by the Palestinians under occupation. On each sheet of glass, Bishara silk-screened a single image, referencing the brutality of the occupation and illustrating the ongoing horror resulting from the marriage of political convenience imposed on the Palestinians in 1948 by the international community. The 56 images were selected by Bishara from the international media and unflinchingly illustrate individually and collectively the sadistic relationship between the occupiers and the occupied. The images are reminiscent of Francisco de Goya's indelible prints from the series The Disasters of War, created between 1810 and 1820, in response to the storm of violence that engulfed his native Spain during the Napoleonic invasion. Yet, instead of Goya's hand-drawn etchings representing the artist's dark, romantic visions of man's inhumanity to man, Bishara's photographic silk-screen prints depict a remarkably sober, yet equally indelible, postmodern vision of a pre-moral, albeit highly mechanized display of human brutality. Each of the 56 images conveys a fragment of an ongoing story. The viewer instantly recognizes that the individual frames are not the whole story, but represent only a single moment that was captured by the camera of a contemporary grand epic of human suffering. Many of the images on the glass are heart-wrenching and elicit an involuntary emotional response to step away from them. That response is instantly checked by the realization that the suspended sheets of glass tightly surround you and that any sudden movement would result in a disastrous shattering of the installation and multiple lacerations to the viewer. Trapped within the translucent glass maze, the viewer has no choice but to walk carefully and to look closely at the painful images that are suspended in irregular overlapping proximity to each other. From any vantage point inside the installation, you can see all of the images, yet you can only see them clearly from close proximity. The color and thin texture of the grainy prints, a warm translucent brown that sits in pointillist-like dots upon the glass, suggests that they've been silk-screened with blood that has darkened through oxidation. How appropriately horrible such a medium would be for these dreadful yet indelible scenes. Yet, at the same moment of thinking that the images were printed with oxidized blood, the viewer becomes aware of a sweet aroma of chocolate permeating the installation, and realizes that the images are silk-screened with dark, unsweetened chocolate to represent the bitterness of life under the longest military occupation in modern history. The complex taste of a potentially sweet and joyful life in Palestine have been usurped by a daily diet of violence, humiliation, and repression. Standing in the shimmering, delicate, and dangerous forest of glass, Surrounded by images representing 56 years of brutal occupation, one becomes aware of his or her moral position and responsibility to the grand tragedy that's depicted in Bishar's installation. The emotions stirred by the images directly implicate the viewer in the political tragedy that has been unveiled by the artwork and compel him or her to ponder the following questions. Why have we been living with these heavy blindfolds that obscure our view of this ongoing tragedy? Who placed these blindfolds upon us? Why is the epic suffering of the Palestinians not adequately conveyed in the media? What are our moral responsibilities to this tragedy? Where do we stand in relationship to the oppressor and the oppressed? And what can we do to help resolve this inhumane misery? The installation leaves the viewer with a deep sense of mourning for the profound loss and agony conveyed in the fragile and grainy images, and at the realization that the final chapter in this tragic epic has not yet been written, as the agony of occupation continues to this day. Bishar's Blindfolded History is not a complete work. In subsequent installations of the work, the artist will add new sheets of glass to commemorate the additional years of occupation that have passed. One is left to wonder, how many sheets of glass will this installation contain before it's finally completed?